I'm Francis Seeley from the Enfield Climate Action Forum. And last night we held one of our forum meetings. And at that meeting, we invited 3 young people from the ENFCAF, or the Enfield Climate Action Forum youth group. And they came on to let people know why climate change mattered to them. And they did a presentation, including PowerPoint, that we're going to reproduce here, because they were really, really knowledgeable about their subject and very much concerned. So let's have a look at the video and see what they felt about how climate change impacts on them and also upon the world around them. Let's watch it now.
Okay. So we just kind of wanted to talk about why we're passionate about climate change. And we each have like different reasons for becoming passionate about climate change. So one of my reasons is just because of the youth strikes. I think that really opened my eyes to the climate crisis. And when me and my sister went on I think it was in 2019, April was like my first one. That really like made me see how serious climate change is and encouraged me to educate myself on the climate crisis. And my kind of journey began there. So yeah, Kim or Anushree, I'm sure you guys all have your personal reasons as well. And you guys might want to talk about your reasons.
Yeah, I can go next. Mine's actually quite similar to Olivia, and I think it was around 2019, maybe a bit before that. As the conversation had been increasing, especially within the youth, I think my attention turned more to climate change and the issues surrounding it, especially with the different protests going on as well. And also, as I was hearing about wildfires quite a lot, which I never really heard about before, but as I was hearing more about those kind of things, and I was doing some research into the reasons why they might be increasing. And I know that there were really big ones in Australia. I think it was last year or the year before. And I actually have family who live there. So I think that was another major thing which brought my attention to climate change and increased my passion towards it.
My passion started when I was watching a lot of documentaries, and I realized the effect it had on animals and the whole extinction and cruel consequences that we don't realize that our actions have on animals. And it was really devastating to watch it. And this was a few years ago, and learning about it in school as well has made me realize how much of a big issue it was and how much responsibility every person has. How we feel about climate change, we think that it's everybody's responsibility, each individual, and everything we do will affect our future generations. So everybody in the world has something related to the future generations. There's an ever-growing demand for resources that we'll never be able to meet. But we continue to exploit these resources, and this causes devastation like extinction to different species, and processes like deforestation has consequences that we see now. As more recent years we see it, and we continue to ignore it. So everyone has the power to move to greener and more sustainable energy. But it's just a matter of when we will do it, before it's too late. And if we can make small changes to our daily lives, we can make a big difference.
So yeah, and one of the things as a young person that I'm really concerned about with climate change is kind of how it disproportionately affects different communities. So different groups like Black, Indigenous people of colour are going to be disproportionately affected because of climate change. People of colour are more likely to live in polluted areas or deprived areas due to other social and racial inequalities. And we can see examples of these like in our local area with Edmonton, with the incinerator. People who are more from a lower economic background are 3 times more likely to be exposed to environmental like pollution or incinerators. And that's just an example of how climate change will disproportionately affect different communities, and something that I find really worrying, especially because of how vast impact climate change will have on us. And then Indigenous communities as well. Indigenous communities have very strong cultural and spiritual and historic connection to their land. And lots of their land is being endangered because of climate change, especially in Canada as well. You can see, I think, the north of Canada, because of the Arctic, because of sea melting, lots of their ways of life are being threatened because, like, as you can see, 87% of native Alaskan villages are experiencing erosion. And so many people being forced to move, but also because of the melting of sea ice, things like seals and polar bears, animals that they hunt are disappearing and becoming endangered. So it is threatening Indigenous people's way of life, their social identity, and their survival, basically, because if they don't have that food and if they can't hunt it, it will obviously impact their survival. So that's another way that climate change disproportionately affects Indigenous communities. And women are also more vulnerable to climate change than men, because during crises, women experience a lot of violence. And an example was with the Hurricane Mitch in Central America in the 90s. Lots of women were avoiding emergency shelters because they were feared of being harassed or experiencing violence. So because of climate change, we're going to be seeing so much more extreme weather events, which are going to displace a lot of people and destroy homes, destroy communities, and women are going to be severely impacted from that. So also, climate change impacts people from lower economic backgrounds. People living in poverty are more likely to be exposed to pollution or environmental contamination or degradation. So when disasters do happen, they're not able to recover from it in the same way as people from higher classes. And in Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, a lot of poor people were left behind, while the rich were able to flee because they had the means to do so. They had transport, they had the money, but a lot of poorer communities and poor individuals were left behind. And because of climate change, this issue is just going to be made bigger and intensified. And then the global south is also really disproportionately affected from climate change. They're not really responsible for climate change in the same way that we in the north are, but they're going to be experiencing some of the worst impacts with droughts, extreme weather events, wildfires, a lot of low-lying regions as well, lots of coastal flooding, and they're all going to be disproportionately affected because of climate change. And this is something that makes me really worried and makes NCAF really worried because it's just not fair that the climate change has created such inequalities and disparities. So this is another reason that we're very passionate about climate change.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about is the fact that responsibility and action isn't necessarily being taken fast enough. And the issues surrounding climate change are extensive. They're affecting more and more aspects of the world and of our lives as time is going on. And I think people aren't necessarily aware enough of what is happening. So, for example, the IPCC predicts that even a 1.5 degree rise in the average global temperature could put 20 to 30% of species at risk of extinction. And that is a huge number, which I just don't think people are necessarily aware of. And it's not necessarily talked about enough as well in the wider world and the wider community. And as well as this, we are also seeing increasing meteorological events. I mentioned before about the wildfires. And I think as time goes on, these events are just going to become more and more common. And we're not really taking the actions to mitigate and prevent these from getting worse as time goes on. So I think that needs to be something that is more put as a more important objective. As well as this, governments, that kind of leads me on. Governments, especially in the developed world, since I would say like the North and the developed world are the ones who are maybe creating more of the issues. However, the actual effects are being felt in lower income countries right now. However, as time goes on, and if this pattern continues, it will be felt over here. And by the time we feel the effects as seriously as it might be being felt elsewhere right now, it might be too late and the effects might be irreversible. So I think if we try to raise more awareness, if governments talk about this issue more and increase policies, increase the amount of time it takes them to implement policies, we'll have a greater impact and effect of combating the issues. And yeah, I think Olivia touched on this before, but I also wanted to mention that developing countries and the global south are being disproportionately affected. So I just put in a couple of examples. So in Kenya, climate-related droughts have already started affecting their livestock production. And this is an industry that they heavily rely on. So although over here we might be feeling issues, in places like Kenya or Africa and lower income countries, even small things that we might think are small affect them in such a huge way, and it can just destroy their livelihoods, their sources of incomes. It increases their risk of disease, malnutrition, food insecurity, salinization of land. Just so many things are happening that we just don't necessarily see ourselves and aren't talked about enough. So this is kind of what I've been saying about awareness. Although we may necessarily have not seen the effects firsthand yet, they are becoming more widespread. And if people aren't seeing the effects firsthand, I think it decreases the connection that they may feel to the issue, which reduces the seriousness that they feel that they have the part to play, and decreases the responsibility that they feel in combating climate change. And I think we need to just change that attitude across the world and see it more as a collective issue that we can all fight together.